Lately, there have been mixed messages when it comes to whether you should wear a mask or not to help protect against COVID-19.
The confusion has led to much anxiety for a lot of folks, and here to talk about that is Elizabeth McInvale, director of the McLean OCD Institute in Houston. Good morning. Thanks for being with us.
Good morning. Thanks for having me.
Tell us a little bit more about yourself and what you currently do with the organization.
Absolutely. So my name's Dr. McInvale, and I myself have lived with OCD and anxiety since I was 12. So I've been pretty open about my own journey, and I really decided to make a career out of it. So I now run and operate the McLean OCD Institute here in Houston, which we are a specialty intensive treatment program for OCD, anxiety, and related disorders. So we've seen a lot in the past couple years around increases in anxiety, not just for people with a diagnosed mental health condition, but for the general population as well.
We also have to mention Mattress Mac is your dad. We just had to put it in there. That is Mattress Mac's daughter. Elizabeth, now as an expert in the field of mental health, what trends have you seen as we enter a new phase of the pandemic where life seems to be a little more normal? Are you seeing some folks find that transition more difficult than others?
Totally, and we see this in general with PTSD as well. So when you think about situations like Hurricane Harvey, right, where a lot of people were experiencing a lot of stress, a lot of distress, and a lot of anxiety, but many people's life was able to go back to normal. But for some people, they couldn't, and that's when you're diagnosed with PTSD, when we see symptoms kind of continue 6 months post a traumatic event. And so when you think about something like the pandemic, for many people, right, as life starts to kind of go back to normal, for some people, they can make that transition and their anxiety doesn't get in the way. But for some folks, we're seeing anxiety really get in the way. We're seeing this with adolescents, we're seeing it with adults and across the board, especially when there is no clear-cut answers, right? What we've learned with this pandemic is that you have to learn to live with anxiety. And for some people, being able to tolerate or live with that isn't really as possible for them, or that can be really triggering. And those are the folks that tend to get more stuck.
Is it almost like a double hit for the adjustment into COVID and then maybe back out of it with regard to anxiety?
Yeah, I think it's interesting. So people with OCD and anxiety in general, we see OCD and anxiety latch on to all sorts of things. So we saw this with Ebola. We see this with COVID. We saw it, even with Hurricane Harvey, if you lived here in Houston. And so it's not totally new that OCD or anxiety is going to latch on to something that's triggering and traumatizing. But what we're finding, is that, a lot of people, I think, got used to the restrictions. Now they're being lifted. And it's like, okay, well, how do I feel about those? Like, as soon as you start to get comfortable and you're able to tolerate certain restrictions, now when they're lifted, it's like, well, who do I believe? And unfortunately, right, what do we know about COVID? Well, we know very little when you think about it, right? It's a new disease. And so we constantly are learning, which means information is constantly changing. For people with anxiety, that's really difficult. We don't want information to change. We want to be able to kind of know what to do and know what guidance to follow. But as we all know, that guidance has shifted throughout this pandemic very frequently.
Yeah, and speaking of that, talking about going back to a more normal day-to-day life, how do you think the recent changes in travel mask mandates will impact folks, especially those diagnosed with OCD and anxiety?
Yeah, it's so tough. I think that if you have been engaging in appropriate treatment and you know how to tolerate your distress at this point and you've been able to learn how to live with uncertainty, then I think for those folks, you actually aren't going to see this be as triggering because they've done the work. They've learned how to live with uncertainty in their life. It's the folks who haven't, right? So what we're actually seeing is that this is impacting more the people who haven't gotten treatment and who don't know how to tolerate anxiety because the back and forth becomes really distressing for them.
Yeah.
Doctor, as folks who've been diagnosed with OCD or anxiety kind of look to the future, look for some hope, I mean, what kind of ways can they cope with the uncertainty and the confusing times, and how can maybe other folks that are watching this interview benefit from that?
Absolutely. So, we have an amazing effective treatment called cognitive behavioral therapy for OCD. It's a specific form of CBT called exposure and response prevention. But what we do is in general, right, we're teaching you to kind of embrace and run towards your fears versus run away from them. So when you think about this pandemic for people without OCD and anxiety, the more you try to control it, the more we're going to get stuck because we don't have control, right? And so it's really about letting go of control and embracing uncertainty. And so if we can teach you to learn to tolerate the uncertainty and to tolerate the distress, you will have more freedom. And so the one thing I'll say is I do think treatment of OCD and anxiety during this era has really allowed individuals without OCD and anxiety, like they've been able to learn so much from our treatment model, because if you can learn to live with uncertainty, you're going to have a lot more freedom than if you try to have certainty right now, because the reality is it doesn't exist for anyone.
Right. And Doctor, we know you've been so open and candid about your own life, your own journey. What inspired you to get into this line of work and help people out the way you do? It's so inspiring. I want to hear more about that journey for you.
Well, thank you so much. And I apologize for not being ready. I didn't realize we're on video today.
You look great.
At Disney. So here we are.
Oh.
I think for me, it's just been that actually. It's, I never in my life would have thought I'd be able to have a 1-year-old and be able to travel and enjoy little pleasures. My OCD was so severe that it took all of that away from me. But because of amazing clinicians, I was able to have that. And for me, if I can give that to one other person, it kind of makes my struggles worth it.
One thing that stands out to me, Doctor, is how open folks have been personally online. And maybe this is just my TikTok feed, but I'm scrolling through and I feel like people are more open about it, like the community, the support.
There's less stigma there?
Yeah, maybe that's what I'm trying to say, is that there's less stigma. Have you noticed that over the years?
I would love to think so. So what we do know is that this generation, especially of adolescents, is more likely to talk about mental health than any generation ever has been. So I think there's a lot of progress. At the same time, I also want to recognize how severely our adolescents are struggling right now, especially with anxiety, mental health, and related disorders. Suicide's at an all-time high. And there's a lot of things that we need to really be aware of and be, it's not, talking is great, but it's also, can we get people to the right treatment, right? That's the second piece, is we never want someone to be talking about their illness, but to not feel like there's hope. What I want to send the message is that no matter how much you're struggling, hope and help are always available. And I think we can get that out there. But I 100% agree. I think stigma has decreased. And I think in cities like Houston, there's been lots of folks who have really spoken up and spoken out, right? And are willing to say things like I've said, right, which is that my name's Liz and I live with OCD, and the more we can put faces to mental health, the more we're able to destigmatize it.
Gosh, we so appreciate all of your contributions and for being with us today and sharing your insight. Dr. Elizabeth McInvale, Director of McLean OCD Institute Houston, thanks for being with us. We appreciate it.
Thank you.